very happy to be introducing to us Dr. Deen Freelon, who's an associate professor at the Hussman School of Journalism and Media at the University of North Carolina. We're particularly privileged to have him here today because inclement weather and the wonders of pandemic and childcare mean that we almost didn't have Deen live with us here, but we do in the end, so we should feel especially lucky. Deen got his undergraduate degree from Stanford and then his PhD from the University of Washington. His work is really wide-ranging and focuses especially on questions around political expression, particularly using digital media. So this has looked at questions of activism and protest movements, for example, the Arab Spring, and also political discussions and political discourse, looking at things like the US presidential debates and topics of disinformation. And then alongside that, he also has some interests that are closer to methods and what we might be looking at in our department, questions of data science and computational social science, for instance. He's done a lot of work on intercoder reliability and developed some tools for that that are widely used. Has looked into questions of possibilities for digital trace data and the development of computational social science generally. Of course, what he's going to be talking about to us today is something different from either of those avenues of research. Instead, he's going to be talking to us about, as you can see here, citation inequities in the social sciences, and specifically looking at the case of communication studies. So I'll pass it over to you now, Deen, and we'll generally hold questions until the end.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Eleanor, and thank you everyone for coming. I just want to say in advance, it's been a little bit of a crazy week over here with the inclement weather, and my kids unexpectedly here in the house today. They're 2 and 5, and so if you hear knocking on the door a little bit, that's them trying to get in. But I've locked the door so they won't get in. That meant that I had a little bit less time to prep this presentation that I wanted to, but we'll see how it goes. I'll try to work through it and try to make as much sense as I can. And if you do have specific questions about anything I've said, I'm happy to answer those at the end of the presentation. So yeah, today's talk is about citation inequities in the social sciences, a topic that is not specific to communication studies, but that being my home field, that is the perspective from which I'll discuss it. So friends, we have, the social sciences rather, has a problem. Actually, the social sciences have a number of problems. The one I'm going to talk about today is, or the frame from which I depart is inequity generally, right? And this is an issue that affects who can do social science, what social science can be, who can see themselves as a social scientist. We're in my home department, we are in application evaluation mode. So we're looking at who is, applying. And a lot of that has to do with whether or not people sort of can see themselves as doing this work, and whether they see that work as being relevant to their interests and concerns. And so I think recognizing, inequity as a problem is, at once sort of a small p political commitment and also a research opportunity. And so empirically, that's one of the things I wanted to look at in this study. Well, the main thing I wanted to look at in the study. And try to see also, not sort of taking any kind of objective view of this, taking a thoroughly normative view of this, trying to figure out what can be done to ameliorate these kinds of issues. And so that is the thrust through which this empirical project, advances. So not only am I trying to diagnose, at the end of the talk, I'll also talk about some things that we might be able to do to make things a little bit better. And so when I talk about inequities, there are a couple of different dimensions through which these express themselves. The one that I'm primarily concerned with is identity-based inequities. These are inequities that are based on race, gender, class, sexual orientation, other indelible aspects of one's identity, or difficultly indelible, I suppose. And so these affect, as I mentioned, what kinds of research can be done, how it can be done, right? The methods that are used to do it, who gets to do it, and then the topic that I'll be discussing most, closely in this talk: who gets credit? Receiving credit is incredibly important in the social sciences. It's what promotion is based on. It's what notoriety is based on. It's what awards are based on. And so that is the focus of this study. And although there are many ways of receiving credit for your work in social sciences, there are a few that are more important than receiving citations in the scholarly literature itself. Right. So as I said, right, citations are the premier method of conferring credit and prestige in academic research. Those of you who are familiar with the subfield of information science that is known as scientometrics is mostly dedicated to it. It's not completely dedicated to it. There are other things that scientometrics does, but it really does focus a lot on citations and how they flow, how they connect different subfields within a discipline, how they connect disciplines and all of that. And so that's a big part of what scientometrics does. And so citation patterns have been studied for a long time, for at least as long as citation databases have been around, and probably before that. They help determine a number of scholarly desiderata, including perceived quality of researchers, articles, journals, and departments. Visibility, which of course is connected to perceived quality in a number of ways. Visibility in databases, syllabi, and other loci of scholarly activity. And also decisions, as I mentioned, about promotions, grants, and awards. So these become an integral part of a scholar's identity and a signifier of their quality and the esteem within which they are held, both in their discipline and also within the field of research, the sort of pool of research within which they swim, which maybe there's one aspect of it that's disciplinary, and then another that of course is interdisciplinary for many scholars. And so this is a big part of that. Right. And so that leads us to the question or the issue of inequities in citation practices. And when you sort of think about that from the perspective of identity-based inequities, the obvious conclusion there is that there are certain identities which disproportionately accrue citations relative to others. The project that I'm discussing in this talk is a broader project. It's work in progress. And so the goal of the project is to take, if not a comprehensive look at citation inequity in the field of communication studies, at least a more wide-ranging and broad-ranging one than previously has been conducted, at least recently, in our field. Now, in terms of empirical results, I'm going to talk about the specific differences between women and men. And the reason I'm going to do that is has to do primarily with convenience. But at the end of this project, I'll have something to say about race. I'll have something to say about national identity, or actually not national identity, of the country in which people are actually doing their work, and several other factors, disciplines as well. And so on a certain level, this invites, the question, one of the things that this work, or one of the reactions that this work tends to elicit, and I find that this happens among social scientists as much as among the general public, is, well, we already know this, right? We know that there are inequities. We know that, men get more citations than women, white people get more citations than Black people, et cetera. And so I sort of hasten to point out that, first of all, you don't really know it until you do the research, or more specifically, you don't know the extent of it until the research is done. And so I think that's a point that's worth reiterating. And so understanding that something may be true, or that there may be an inequity, I think, is one thing, and quantifying that, providing a baseline against which future changes or the efficacy of interventions can be assessed in the future, I think is incredibly important, and one of the primary goals of this research. So I don't know how much you all know about the field of communication, so I'm going to talk about it for a little bit. Sometimes the The old joke that one of my colleagues likes to tell is that somebody from one of the hard sciences once called up the Department of Communication at his university and tried to get them to write up a press release for a study he had recently done. So that's not what we do. We're not the PR department, but sometimes confused for that. So the field of communication is, as a social science and as a field of research more generally, is fairly young. A century or less, depending on when you measure it from. We're coming up on, actually next year, we're coming up on the 100th anniversary of one of our foundational texts. That's Public Opinion by Walter Lippmann, very exciting book. The field of communication is theoretically and methodologically heterogeneous, right? So I would say that's a lot more true than in fields like political science, sociology, psychology, in which the canon is much more integrated. All students are expected to have read a certain set of authors and works in those fields. It's less true in the field of communication. One thing that also distinguishes communication is that it cites other disciplines heavily, which I think also sets it apart from some of the other social sciences. Not only does it cite other disciplines heavily, it also imports scholars from those disciplines, in terms of employment. So it's a lot easier, for example, as a political scientist to get a job as in a communication department than it is to get a job in a political science department if you have a communications PhD. So that's just what it is. So a few examples of what we study. There's communication law. This is not a representative sample. I picked these only to demonstrate breadth. So there's communication law and policy, which is more like a legalistic form type of research, both methodologically and in terms of its content. Health communication, which is more applied in nature. Obviously, it's a big deal now, but with COVID-19. Journalism studies, which is one of the older subfields dating back to the 40s and 50s. Organizational communication, which overlaps with management science. And then popular communication, which has a lot of overlap with cultural studies. And like most fields of the social science and fields of research in general, it's very white and very male, both in terms of who occupies the top of the discipline and who tends to get cited the most. So I want to talk about a research study, probably the single study. I don't spend a whole lot of time reviewing the research in this talk, but I do want to mention one study that was published a couple of years ago, that the title of which is simply hashtag communication so white, and that's a takeoff on the pre-existing hashtag Oscars so white, which came out in 2015 to protest the overwhelming whiteness of the Academy Awards. And so the study is by Chakravarty et al. It was a landmark study of 12 disciplinary comm journals between 1990 and 2016, focused on race, finding that 14% of first authors were non-white. Articles first authored by non-whites were cited significantly less than those by whites. That's a mean of 1.7 to 2.5. And also that there was strong, what they referred to as citational segregation, which meant that whites tended to cite whites, and then non-whites tended to cite non-whites. And so the current study actually advances one of the main contributions of this study is really just talking about this at all, because one of the major consequences of inequities in the social sciences is that there are certain topics that simply are not discussed, is that identity tends to be underplayed relative to its importance, in the topics that are of concern in these various disciplines. I had a colleague of mine tell me that submit to a major journal in our field, was talking about gender disparities in politics, and apparently a reviewer wrote that that is not a proper, concern of the discipline. And I was really flabbergasted when I heard that, not because the person believed it, but because they would actually say so, so forthrightly and so openly. And I found that extremely unpalatable, and that was one of the reasons I wanted to do this study. Anyway, so this is a really great study, just for it's actually a really short study, very short, but it made its point. It's pretty well cited despite having been released in 2018, and really putting this issue on the agenda. It's already spawned a number of reaction studies and rightly so. But it had a number of limitations, some of which the current study improves upon. Firstly, it took a binary view of race, right? So it looked only at people who were white versus non-white. It didn't actually look at the other races, which this study does. In looking only at race, it didn't consider gender or other factors that are potential covariates and whose effects could be compared to one another. And also one difference is that this study looks at 12 disciplinary journals. And so these are journals that are associated with the two main professional associations in communication, the International Communication and the National Communication Association. Whereas my study looks actually at the most cited journals in communication, or some of the most cited journals in communication, and also looks at the most cited individuals within those journals. So we're looking at the top of the field, people who are setting the agenda, people who are, full professors who have the most power. And so that is another difference in focus that this study takes, that the current study takes. Right, so mention some of this, right? Most cited authors, highly cited journals, distinguishing between multiple races. And then here are some of the additional explanatory factors for citation. As I mentioned earlier, gender. There's another one for country level economic development. For those of you who have worked in this area, there's the UN West, but it's like a world economic situation, I guess, World Economic Situation Prospects, something like that. I can't remember what the SB stands for. The WE stands for World Economic. Basically, it divides the world's countries into three tiers. Number one is the highly industrialized. Second is sort of mid-tier countries, and the third is developing economies. So it's a nice ordinal scale there. We look at public and private institutions, a couple of measures of university rankings, discipline of origin, and of course, time in the field. Obviously, people who have been around for a little bit longer would be expected to have more citations. And so controlling for that is pretty important. And so trying to move toward a more holistic perception of what exactly is driving these in the presence of other factors that may explain differences in citation rates among the top most cited individuals within our field. So the data for this study come from Web of Science. The journal citation reports, if you've dealt with this data, if you have questions about it, I've spent a lot of time dealing with Web of Science data, so I'm happy to talk about it. And so what I did was we exported full citation, full quote unquote, this is their words, right? So that's why it's in quotes. Full citation data for the top 10 communication journals from 2000 to 2019. And so we actually relied on JCR's classification of communication journals. And so that basically, I think the first time that appeared was in 2003. And so we ended up doing that. We considered incorporating information from Scopus and Google Scholar, but those rankings didn't start showing up until the 2010s. And we didn't want the journal selection to be weighted toward the latter end of the time period. So we just went with JCR, which is pretty comprehensive. And so I also wanted to provide a sample citation just to show you what the data look like. And so this citation is to one of my papers. And you can see a couple of things here. The first of which is it only has the first author. This paper has 3 authors on it, but it only lists the first author. So this study that I'm going to be talking about only looks at the first author. It has the journal name, but it abbreviates it. So you have to be able to do a little bit of detective work to figure out what journal it is if that's what you're interested in. And then the other problem is that in many cases the DOI doesn't work, which is actually something that I feel like, if you're paying for JCR, you should at least get the DOIs to be functional. But in many cases the DOIs were broken, which made positive identification of some of the journals and authors a little bit difficult. But we persisted and we tried to get around that, even despite some of the inherent limitations in the data with which we were working. So those of you who have worked with data that come from Web of Knowledge know that substantial data cleanup was required or is required. So the first problem we encountered is the fact, so we called these, so we call this part, I'm actually gonna hop back a second. So the Freelon D piece of this, we refer to as a JCR name. It's not an actual name. And so the goal, one of the main goals that we had for the first part of this research was the conversion of JCR names to professional names. And those are names as listed on the journals and books that people write. So the JCR names omit first names. They use initials only. So rather than, my most widely used professional name is Deen Freelon, but so it'll say Freelon D. It omits first name most of the time. For some reason, it includes some full names sometimes, but mostly it omits the first name. There also is an issue where multiple authors share the same JCR names. I'll give the example later of Cohen J, which refers to a bunch of different people. And that's only in our sample. Probably in other fields it refers to even more people. And so there's also the opposite problem where individual authors have multiple JCR names. I do, because early in my career, I used my middle initial, but I stopped doing that. One thing I would strongly recommend for those of you who are just starting to publish, use the shortest possible name that uniquely identifies you. It's just the easiest thing to do. And I wish I'd done this, because I would have been in this top set of users if I'd done that, but my methodology basically is biased against people who have multiple professional names. But we felt like the trade-offs made a lot of sense, even if it meant that my own name was not included among the elect of individuals who I analyze here. I felt like that was a worthy sacrifice. Maybe next time. And so one of the main sort of data cleanup tasks that we had to do was the citations needed to be indexed to standardized author names. And so we ended up spending a lot of our data prep time doing that. Oops. So step one, and so I'm going to go through the methodological steps we did this being a methodological department, I'm hoping you'll appreciate this. So we extracted the names. So for the 10 journals over 20 years, we extracted 8,816 research articles. We omitted, non-research stuff, reviews, that sort of thing. And Web of Knowledge actually makes that pretty easy. This resulted in 369,682 unique citations with a mean of 41.9 citations per article. And we extracted all JCR names we use regex for that. I use regex for that. And I got the top 1,200. The idea being that I wanted a target of roughly 1,000. And so I needed some that I could eliminate for various reasons. And so I extracted more than that. And so by JCR names, we simply counted unique occurrences, right? So that's just like flat string equation before any sort of disambiguation. And so that left us with 1,200 to work with as we went through and disambiguated there. So step 2A was to identify JCR names. I have my two wonderful research assistants who did this last semester. They reviewed all references associated with each JCR name to determine the professional name associated with it. And they did this using a combination of Google Scholar, Google Search, and a custom Jupyter notebook I created, which I actually want to show you. And for some reason, I was smart enough to peg the screen share only to my PowerPoint, having forgotten that I was going to do this. So I'm going to unshare for just a second and reshare and just do the regular screen share so that you can see what I'm saying. And I'm going to try to find this. This is probably tempting fate a little bit, but this is a hallmark of the presentations I like to do. Oh, yes, there it is. All right, there, got it in one. Okay, so this is the interface that they used. Hopefully the code is still running here. So what they were enabled to do is they could type in the name of the individual, hit enter, and then they could see all of the citations that were associated with that person. They would use this information to go through and try to figure out what this person's professional name was. And so that entailed them trying to figure out the names of the journals and the publications, and then reading that primarily off of Google Scholar. And for currently research active people, that was actually pretty easy. For folks who hadn't been research active in a while, that was a little more difficult. But most of the time it worked out fairly well. And so they ended up doing that. I'll put another one of my colleagues' names in here. This is another. So yeah, you can see that ended up working out through this. And so that is I thought this was a really neat way to do it. I couldn't think of a way that would make their lives easier insofar as an interface through which they did this. The code for this is pretty short. I just had a little database of the full list of references that this uses, and then just a little while loop that allows them to do this. And so this interface actually through Jupyter, I highly recommend because it lets them do this. And then if you have, a pretty common last name, you can do that. And then, you see all the different Smiths and stuff like that. So you can do, you can do it like that. So this was, I thought I'd show this just because I thought it was a pretty neat way of doing this and interrogating the database, pulling that information out there, and then having these references point to specific professional names, which were then recorded in a spreadsheet. All right, let me go back to the PowerPoint. All right. So, and so during this process, the research assistants were asked to note whenever a JCR name might refer to multiple individuals. So a good example of this is Cohen J, and I'll show you how they did something like this. So I'll type in Cohen J. This was actually the most popular, the highest cited name that was that sort of referred to a number of individuals who were well known in the field. So and so when you look at this, you can, one of the things they started to do, and one of the main keys to this is they took a look at the general sort of keywords or terms that were abbreviated and tried to discern the different general areas of interest. And so J. Cohen is an interesting example. So there are a number of papers from the 60s that were published by Jacob Cohen, who is a well-known psychologist or basically a psychometrics guy who came up with a number of metrics, including Cohen's kappa, which is a major intercodal reliability metric. Then in the 80s, you start seeing philosophy stuff that's done by Joshua Cohen, who's a well-known philosopher who's currently an in-house philosopher at Apple. And so basically by looking, applied multiple regression, statistical power and analysis, but then you start seeing things like ethics, philosophy and social criticism, public opinion is probably Jacob again, deliberative democracy, good polity, normative, et cetera, more philosophical terms. And so when they started to see those vastly diverging keywords that referred to completely different areas of scholarly inquiry, that was a key indicator that they were looking at a single JCR name that referred to multiple individuals. And I told them to simply note that. So they say this probably refers to multiple individuals, and they would put that in a note as a spreadsheet to investigate later. So yeah, so this is the example. So these are four of the identities that Cohen J refers to. Jacob Cohen, the renowned statistician, the announced philosopher at Apple. Jonathan Cohen, who's at the University of Haifa, is a scholar of popular communication, and also Julie Cohen, who's a law professor at Georgetown. There are several other ones that were referred to just a little bit, but these were probably the top four most frequently referred to J. Cohens. And that just gives an example of how you simply can't use the data as they come out or as they emerge from JCR, and you need to do a little bit more work to ensure that you are identifying people effectively. And so this part of the research, we found it extremely difficult to automate. And so with our aim to identify people as positively and as correctly as possible, we ended up having to do this part manually. And so then it came time to disambiguate the shared JCR names. And so for every JCR name that was judged to be a shared name, like J. Cohen, I had my RA search every reference and note the author's full professional name. So for J. Cohen, they went through and looked every single one of these references up. Fortunately, there was a lot of overlap. Like all these, for example, are the same. Actually, yeah, these 5 references are all the same. So there was a little bit of collapsing that they could do because things were cited like slightly differently, and that made things a little bit easier. But they looked up every single reference and they wrote out every single name, and that's just in the name of thoroughness. And they were able to, and so some of them were unknown because they couldn't find some because the abbreviations were just too obscure and they couldn't figure it out. But they were able to positively identify professional names in over 95% of cases. But it took weeks. It was painstaking work, to look up every single reference, write down the name, go to the next one. And so that took a while to actually get done. But the result was that they, by the end, the ambiguous names were almost completely disambiguated, which was exactly what we needed to do to be able to have some decent confidence in our conclusions. And then, so then the next step was to index the professional names to the references. So I just wrote a Python script to take the professional names that we extracted from the JCR names and then basically just index those to the references. And that was necessary to be able to get the citation counts. So to be able to say, okay, the professional name of Deen Freelon, for example, got this number of citations, and that counted all references to Freelon D as well as Freelon DG, which would have been treated differently as they came out of JCR. And then so for the opposite way, like for each of the individual professional reference of J. Cohen, count all those up using only the references that refer to the specific individuals that were disambiguated using the process just described. And so the current step is in progress, and I'm currently having my my research assistants generate metadata. And so for each professional name, again, this is manual in nature. This is actually just a very straightforward content analysis. So they're looking for the following data. They've been instructed to classify gender on the basis of photo, name, and/or pronouns in Google searches and bio pages on departmental websites. Race will be classified through gender and/or self-declared race using the same data sources. And then there are a number of data points that are going to come from the main institution, including WESP category, whether the institution is public or private, Times Higher Education, institution ranking, U.S. News and World Report global institution ranking, discipline and year of first academic publication. And so they're just basically recording that manually. There's only 1,000 of these, and so it's a pretty tractable approach. And so I don't think this will take as long as the disambiguation process. But that's really important to be able to generate this. The process for racial classification is a bit more fine-grained than was used in the ComSo white paper. They actually used a probability of basically predictiveness of surname of race versus for white, non-white using census data, which is I guess an okay technique, but it's pretty error prone. So we wanted something that was a bit more fine-grained. They actually had they had a lot more data than we did as well. So I think that this will be a lot less error-prone situation, because you won't have also that tactic tends to work better for men than it does for women due to the fact that many women change their names after they get married. And so this is something that we're in most cases, the RAs will be looking at these folks' faces and making those race and gender judgments. And so I'm thinking that will end up with data that is a little bit more accurate than those probability judgments. All right, so I do have a preliminary gender analysis that I'm going to present to you all. And this is actually done using gender prediction software that's based on the first name, which is a little bit more valid than race prediction from the surname. And so I'm using a program called Python's gender prediction module. It's a machine learning approach that uses its training data, draws the training data from the US Census. Unfortunately, I had to, well, fortunately, probably I had this presence of mind to actually look for this. I had to manually correct this because the model got most of the data right, but it had some very notable problems. And so if you do gender classification, you'll want to really manually inspect this, because it got the incorrect genders for very common names like Mike and Lauren. So I had to manually correct those. And again, because the data set was fairly small in nature, that wasn't too difficult. But if you do this, especially if you do a machine learning approach as opposed to a dictionary approach for this, you really are going to want to do some checking to make sure that you don't have some very obvious issues with the classification of very unambiguous names from a the number of people who have them and who are classified as one gender or another. So here's some preliminary analyses. I actually don't expect these to change a whole lot based on the content analysis. So the top, I think it's like 1,002 people of the top most cited individuals, 749 are men, 253 are women. About 3 times as many men as women. The total citation numbers, the factor there is actually pretty similar. About 77% of the citations went to men, 23% to women. The difference ratio is a little bit higher, but not that different. What's interesting about this is that the mean citations and median citations are actually pretty close. There is a disparity, but it's actually not that big. And so, the first thing I thought of when I saw this is that the disparity is driven primarily by differences in numbers among the top individuals cited, not by significant disparities on a per individual basis. So there is a disparity there, but it's not like monumentally huge. And so what that indicates to me is that you want to have new individuals, women in this case, that are cited, and add those to the folks that are already on this list to be able to help rectify this, as opposed to having to shift the shift targeted citation behaviors with respect to people that are already in the top 1,000 individuals. I also looked at this via deciles. This is just a super descriptive look at this, and you can see that the disparity is disproportionately driven by the top end of the distribution. So if you look at the bottom deciles, they're pretty close in terms of differences, but as you go up, the disparity tends to get magnified. And then when you're looking at the very top decile here, it's you can see that difference pretty clearly. And then but when it's lower, they're actually pretty close to equal on the bottom deciles here. And then this is just the top decile divided into percentiles. And you can see here that when you split that up into percentiles, looking at the very top, this is just 90 through 100. That it's driven really by the last two, like the 99th and the 100th here. So this is really like the tippy top of the discipline, right? These are people who are, professional association presidents, called by the New York Times when they need quotes on these kinds of issues, folks with maximum visibility. And that's where the disparity is at its most stark. So that was the all too brief empirical portion of this. The rest of the empirical aspects of this are forthcoming. We're still working on that, but I didn't want to show you those results briefly. So some of the implications of this work, again, as I mentioned earlier, gender inequity in citations are driven primarily by population imbalance, not imbalances in terms of citations per individual. Differences in citations per author between men and women were minimal. But the thing to remember is that this is the big names only, right? This is the top 1,000 most cited individuals among these top journals. And so in the long tail, if you look at other folks, the dynamic may be different, but at least among the most cited folks, that is the situation, right? And again, the differences are driven by the very top of the distribution, like literally the 99th and 100th percentiles are where it's the most stark. And so to diversify those ranks, need to add new women rather than citing the ones more that are already there. You can imagine a situation in which, so this may very well be the case for racial differences, right? So if the citations per individual, if there's a big disparity difference there in terms of means and medians, then you have another problem that also needs a rectification. So there are a number of lingering questions here. Will the results change after a human-driven gender classification? I don't think they will, but they might change a little bit. I don't expect huge changes there. How will they compare to the results of the race and Westphal analyses, right? So when we split up into different categories based on different races as well as different countries, what are the magnitudes of the disparities going to be relative to gender there? I'm also going to be able to look at changes in results over time. I tried to get that analysis done for this talk, but I ran out of time, sadly. And then how will the effect sizes of all these variables differ in terms of predicting citation counts? And that's one of the major results of this that we're going to work on for the final paper. And so what I'm working toward is something that looks like this. And so this is what you might, this is something similar that you might see in like a pre-registered, paper. And so you got all your predictors here on the left, model 1, model 2. And so we'll be able to look at those betas and be able to compare the effect size of all of these different variables relative to one another. And again, this gets us toward what I was talking about earlier, which is a more holistic look at citational inequities in the specific case of communication research, and really helps us to figure out which areas seem to be doing better than others, and also critically providing a baseline for future research to see how things are changing over time, and also potentially to assess the efficacy of interventions that are aimed at reducing these kinds of inequities. So I already mentioned the issue of, didn't we know this already, right? You don't know anything until someone does the research. Nothing generalizable. Obviously, individual experience doesn't count for anything, but anecdote is not the plural of data. And so let's keep that in mind. I try to keep this in mind with people say things like, oh, we already knew this already. And so research of this type, both ComSoWhite and this project, are helping us to get some idea of the extent of the problem, how big is it, what's it going to take to fix it, et cetera. That empirical baseline issue is really important, not only to track how this issue changes over time, whether it gets better, gets worse, or stays the same, but also to compare situations across disciplines. So, if you're thinking about sociology, political science, psychology, economics, whatever else, history, you can try to figure out how those differences, using a method like this, you can compare citational differences, using those, using something like this as a baseline. And then just more generally, rigorous empirical measurement is an important step in the march toward equity, right? So a lot of this work and a lot of these observations are done by scholars in critical studies who don't do a whole lot of empirical research. And so this is one area in which empirical research, quantitative research, can be done to serve those more critical ends. And so now I want to talk a little bit about how we might change our practices, right? So different inequities have different solutions, right? So citing certain women in certain who occupy certain ethnic categories is facilitated by the correlation between first name and gender, which is pretty strong for people who have names that originate in Europe. And also other countries as well. It's not as strong in other societies. Judging race and ethnicity based on surname is a bit more fraught. It works better for some ethnicities than others. It works better for men than women, as I mentioned. And overall, it's not something I would do if I could possibly avoid it due to the risk of error. If you want your work to be as rigorous as possible, I would try to seek alternative methods of judging race and ethnicity, and that's what we're doing in this project. And so what can we do as researchers? One thing that I would really recommend that everybody here do is to spend some time learning about the underrepresented minorities in your field. And so one way to do this is to visit online department directories, right? So I find a lot of times when I cite people, I don't necessarily know, what race or ethnicity they are. And so, visiting those online department directories, like just seeing their faces. Another way to do this is to take note of who's got their camera on at Zoom talks like this one. Right. So if there are people from outside your department, you can take a look at who's there. I mean, obviously not everybody has their camera on, but you may have an opportunity to do that in some of the talks via Zoom that you are involved in. Generally be aware of the non-white, non-men that are working in your area and cite them whenever relevant. Right. Be purposive in your citations. Obviously, nobody's saying that you should cite work that's not relevant, but knowing that people whose backgrounds are underrepresented, are undercited, I think it is incumbent upon people to seek out and make sure that folks who are contributing to the areas in which they work, to make sure that those citations are equitably distributed. Let me talk a little bit about some methodological limitations. The JCR data are limited to first author, as I mentioned. They're not perfect. Some of the names are damaged. There are partial titles of journals, which makes things harder. Broken DOIs. Another issue that you run into is people who don't have sort of standard, I don't want to say standard, but last names that are single words. So if it's De La something or Del something like that, you know, JCR really does not deal with those names very well, and so we had to work extra hard to make those names, you know, fit the format and to code those properly. Some of this comes from citation errors in the original articles. In other words, you can actually let JCR off the hook in some cases. There are actual original citation errors in the reference lists. And so that can include things like misspelled names, incorrect volume and issue numbers, which also make things a little bit harder. So we had to work around that. And then there is, of course, inconsistent use of professional names. The biggest culprit here is the presence or absence of the middle initial. And that was my issue, right? As I mentioned, my earlier publications had the middle initial, my later ones don't. JCR, and so the method that I'm using computationally counts me as two different people because of that. And so I recommend please be consistent as much as possible if you want to make yourself computationally visible to these kinds of analyses, and make people who use make the lives of people who use this kind of data easier, right? Something that any methodologist should certainly appreciate. And then also, it's hard to deal with authors that aren't people, right? So APOR, the Association of American Public Opinion Research, Pew, which puts out a lot of public opinion data for the United States, and other institutions, you know, the European Commission and some of the other ones, dealing with those is a little bit hard too, because it doesn't have the sort of standard first name, last name, or last name, first initial, you know, format that the regex is you know, designed to classify. Oh gosh, yes. So in conclusion, make sure you're not only citing white guys. Thank you very much. And that is the end of my talk, and I will now take questions.
All right, thanks very much for that, Dean. Yeah, who would like to start us off with some questions? Maybe Dean, if you stop sharing your screen, we can hopefully see some faces.
Sure, and I guess I can reshare that if you want to take another look at
yeah,
one of the slides.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. All right, well, I'll selfishly go first then, and I'll let people formulate questions a little bit further. So you mentioned this briefly, but I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about the decision to focus on the top most cited individuals. I remember hearing somewhere, you know, if you look at the effect of height among NBA players, there's no effect of height, right? So height is not an advantage if you're looking among people who have made it to the NBA, right? So if you're looking at the top cited people in a particular field, might we not expect to see really a very different pattern there than we would be seeing if we were to take in, you know, the citations for the, you know, not just the top 100 or sorry, top 1,000, but you know, a fuller span of the distribution of citations and authors in the field.
Sure, there are a couple of different reasons for that. The first, so there's one reason that's practical, which I'll mention first, and that actually focusing on the top actually makes the analysis more tractable, but it also allows us to apply methods that we would not be able to apply to a larger group. So the content analysis that we're using to determine race and gender would not be feasible for a much larger group of individuals. As I mentioned, the Communication So White article used probability estimates for surnames derived from the US Census, which and they actually did not report error rates for that. In fact, I'm not sure how they would have done that, because, you know, they simply use the estimates and they don't know. They actually don't know. So their error rate is unknown. And so precision is one reason for that. But the other reason, and more important reason, has to do with agenda setting, right? These are people at the top of the field. These are people that are most visible. These are the people who decide what is really important in communication research and what is not. So these are folks who have disproportionate power. And the people to whom folks who are up and coming and who are applying to grad school are going to look to work with as PhD students. These are folks who have, you know, the big and best known grad students who are able to go on to the top universities. These are folks that are disproportionately likely to be relied upon in the media for their perspectives when they're you know, when their topic comes up in the news. And so I do think that we do get a lot of mileage out of focusing on people at the top because of their disproportionate power, because of their ability to set the agenda for the discipline as a whole. And so I don't think that it's necessary to be able to generalize. And in fact, I would expect that there would be very different patterns if you looked at the long tail of this. But I do think that there are very important reasons to be able to focus on that very top slice the distribution, from a theoretical standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. Ken, you want to go next, and then Alia?
Lower hand. Hi, Dean. Thanks for the interesting talk.
Sure.
This is a really important issue. And when I was on the editorial team of the American Political Science Review, we gathered a lot of data, and we tried to investigate this issue for both race and gender. And it's very tricky because, what we found was essentially the sort of things that everyone knew when it came to the output, that women were underrepresented by a ratio of about 2 to 1 in terms of their publications. But we also found that conditional on a manuscript being received by a female, the chances of their manuscript being accepted versus the men was not only not lower than the men, but slightly better. So they were less likely to submit in the first place, but once submitted, we found that the process was more than fair to them. And I noticed in your talk you used inequities, but inequities suggests a type of lack of fairness, whereas the results you showed seem to me to be more a result of inequality, which may or may not be fair. It may come from, there are all sorts of levels at which we could identify the unfairness. But I can imagine, wading into this difficult field, you would have to sort out the difference between inequality and what would be some sort of inequity or unfairness. And given the sort of structure I just mentioned about the APSR, how would you distinguish those two?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I may have been a bit loose in my language, and I thank you for that comment. And so I think you can certainly point to the existence of inequality. That certainly, I think, is evident in the data. The issue I think we run into is I don't think that our data will ultimately allow us to analyze the kind of conditionality that you talked about, because we simply don't know enough about the decision processes that go into who is cited and who's not. I mean, if you have ideas about how to do that, I'm certainly open to those. Thinking about it now, nothing's immediately coming to mind. I do think it's interesting, to consider the difference between the per user medians and means, which, as I note, are fairly close. There is a disparity; it's not huge, versus the fact that there are just so many fewer women that sort of reach that height in the first place. I think that that certainly is consistent with an inequity narrative. It certainly could be. I think one criticism that can be aimed at it is to say, well, there's not conclusive evidence that it is, and so that invites the question of what would be. And so I think one way around that is to simply say, well, this could be inequity, right? In other words, there could be some unfairness that is inherent here. More than anything else, is probably there's probably a big factor of path dependence here, rather. The fact that, like, as the discipline has diversified over the past few decades, basically the folks who are new entrants to the field have not had enough time to catch up in terms of being like a foundational name, and so I think one way to test that is basically to look to see whether this thing fixes itself over time, in 10 to 20 years. But one of the things that I really want to point out is that this is not necessarily the kind of situation that we necessarily need to wait to fix itself. We can make some affirmative steps in terms of making that move a little bit faster. But I do take the point, and thank you for that.
Thanks so much for your presentation, Dean. I had a couple of questions that are about citations, and they may be answered by the fact that you focus on the top 1,000, but I just want to ask them anyway. One is just thinking about how do self-citation practices matter in this process, whether they do or not at all, in terms of citation counts. And the other is, I wonder if there's a way, and this might not matter again because it's top 1,000 people who are most cited, but whether, when pieces are sometimes cited a lot for being wrong, but everyone references them, so they have outsized influence, but not like a good influence, whether that matters for this. And then I have one question that's separate from these two, but I thought I'd ask these first.
Okay, so So there is the question of the extent to which people cite things for being wrong, and then of course self-citations. So with self-citations, one of the limitations of the data is because you only get the first author. If somebody, let's say that I as a first author then cite a piece on which I'm second author, that would be invisible to this process, right? Because only the first author is captured. So you would be able to capture self-citations of first authors by first authors, but when you get into multi-author situations, that becomes a lot harder to do. So I'd have to think about how to sort of evaluate that, but like the easy way to do it is kind of wave my hands and say, well, it's a limitation. And I think, historically, like self-citations can only like there's a theoretical maximum of which, self-citations can comprise the total number of citations you get, because you only put so many papers out and there's a lot of other people out there. And also you would expect that self-citations would probably be less of a problem at the top because they have so many citations flowing in, so much attention on them, that there would be less of an issue there. More than likely, and the number of other people citing them relative to their own citations would probably grow a little bit larger there. Let's see. Gosh, now I'm totally forgotten the other part of the question. So self-citations, and then citations for being wrong. That I think is a little bit harder, because in many cases, when there is a lot of times you see citations that are of the following form. Well, we really liked what Freelon did in this area and that area, but he totally got this other thing wrong, right? So in other words, it's not just, oh, this person is completely wrong or this person is completely great. It's, let's analyze certain aspects of this author's work that we thought did a really good job, but really had some major shortcomings in this other area. And so I don't think you can really dichotomize it in that way. I think most of the time, if you're citing someone, you're doing so because they did at least something right. I think it's the rare piece that like got something so wrong-headed and so completely, incorrect, and yet has some influence anyway. I think that's probably not a modal case there. But I do think there are lots of situations where it sort of goes in the middle, where there's certain aspects that you praise and certain aspects that you use for an opportunity for future or for your own contributions, to sort of highlight your own contributions. So yeah, I think that would be more likely to be the kind of citation, or at least those are the kind of citations I try to do, right? So maybe it's different in other kinds of disciplines. I was having a conversation on Twitter with some folks from other kinds of disciplines, in which they sort of said that the norm in their discipline is basically to sort of tear the canon apart, right? So to sort of poke holes in existing research as much as possible, to sort of tear it down. Whereas I sort of come from these sort of shoulders of giants citation school, right? To say like, look, really great things that have been done, we're advancing it. Here's the contribution I'm making to this, sort of expressing gratitude toward the work that was done, and also appreciating that, like, prior research is what makes your research possible. So that tends to be the lens through which I approach it, but I understand that there are other approaches that are a little bit less charitable, but yeah.
So if I can, I'll just ask my less related question now, and thinking more about, because I mean, this is a study that you framed it as more like these things matter because promotions and things like that, like it's a professional reason. But another reason this could matter is because it's really about not building knowledge, right? Like whose ideas matter, whose ideas then gain credence. And thinking along those lines, and kind of related to Ken's question about APSR and so on, what I'm thinking is, what do you think broadly about these, or what are your thoughts on, have you thought about just like where people are publishing, where they're able to publish, right? Like, I mean, so one reason I can think, for instance, why women may not be submitting to something like APSR or AJS or ASR in my field of sociology is that they see, like, for instance, AJS as a journal where people who study organizations, like that's where, like, if you're doing something like that, that's where you send that. But if you're doing something, even maybe gender in organizations, that may not be that friendly, so you send it to Gender and Society, where people are making those decisions. And we have set, like, basically, I'm just curious about what pathways beyond citation that happened prior to citation do you think matter, and what are your thoughts on it?
Sure, yeah. So one of the reasons for focusing on the top journals is because the top journals are more likely to be what are considered flagship journals, right? And less likely to be considered disciplinary journals or subdisciplinary journals that focus on specific areas. And at least in theory, a flagship journal should be willing to publish anything that is of sufficient interest. So from any area of inquiry within that larger discipline. And so what that ends up meaning is that if the flagship journals are, I guess discriminating is probably too value-laden a word, but if the flagship journals are ignoring certain perspectives and saying that certain areas of inquiry are not worthy of being included, that basically means that people who study that simply are not going to have an opportunity to get the citations to get the level of citations that publishing in such a journal would afford them. And so I think there's a bit of a chicken and egg type situation, right? So at least ideally, you want anybody from any valid area in your discipline to be able to get into one of those journals, because that's a pathway toward a lot of the professional things that I talked about, right? So it's a pathway toward prestige, a pathway toward moving up the departmental ladder, getting to the more prominent departments, getting promoted and the rest of it. And so if people are looking at those kinds of journals and saying, oh, well, they only publish those kinds of things, I think that's a problem, right? Because what you have there is a situation in which a flagship journal or in which you have basically a disciplinary journal in the guise of a flagship journal, right? Because nominally, so the flagship journal in my field is called the Journal of Communication, right? So the Journal of Communication should be able to publish from any, and so in their aims and scope, they say we publish from any area of communication. But if that's not the case, that's a problem, because it locks out people who do important work on important topics, but that don't fit the perceived mode. And a lot of that, again, is determined by the editor-in-chief, right? So whoever is we all know that the folks have biases and things of this nature. But I do think that those things, at least my normative position is that those areas should be open. And I hope that the research that I'm conducting will help people think about the openness of those top tier publications, because they do open up opportunities that other publications simply don't.
Ellie, did you want to read out your comment there, or give your comment personally?
I can do. I mean, yeah, just to agree with everything that's being said, and I think that it may well be down to identity, but I also think it's about knowledge production, kind of as alia was pointing out. And there's this teal and dealing piece. And sorry, I should have said not acceptance, but submission and acceptance. But yeah, really pointing to methodological differences as methodology, knowledge production, fields of study as potentially explaining kind of everything that's going on. So it's not just about women being published less or scholars of color being published less, but it's really about the knowledge that they're generating in the first place and the kind of the position and power that has in the discipline. That was the only kind of comment I wanted to make, but just kind of agree with everything that's been said so far.
Yeah, and I did mention that. I mean, that's certainly something that I'll want to talk about in the paper a bit more. And so that, I think, is something that is extremely important, right? So when I talked about, it determines, who gets to speak and what gets to be said, right? This was a point that was observed in this Communications So White article, that non-white scholars tended to talk about identity a lot more than white scholars did. And so the effect of that is that certain things are just going to get talked about a lot less when you have that degree of disproportion that is present in representation in the journals, and so as well as in citation practices, which is what this project focuses on. And so the promotion aspect is really big. The representation aspect is really big. The knowledge production aspect is also really big. I think all of that testifies to the importance of this general line of research. And hopefully the studies that will build on this one when it's published.
Jacinto, did you want to ask your question now?
Yeah, thank you. I'm gonna turn on my camera since I'm pretty hard to classify in terms of gender and race just by my name. So thank you for that excellent talk. It's really interesting. It's interesting also the insight that the differences that you see in citations, at least as far as gender is concerned, depends more on the demographics of the field than on discrimination itself, that is, female scholars being cited less because they are female. Now, I wonder if your hypothesis, now that you're moving into that second stage where you look at differences in citation by race, is not that in that case, at least, or in the case of race, there may be differences in citations that are at the individual level, not so much in terms of the distribution of race groups within the field and their status, but more in terms of some scholars being cited less because of their race. And if that is the case, well, number one, my question is that your hypothesis? And number two, even though you mentioned earlier that you did not really have insights into the decision-making process, which would be why are people citing these other people more or less? I think if that's a finding, then you might need a theory about why that is the case, and I would be really curious about what that theory would be, because at least in my field, which is sociology, I feel that scholars are very much aware about this kind of potential discrimination biases, and the idea that, for instance, racism itself would be the driver behind non-white scholars being cited less, I think would be problematic, at least in that specific intellectual and cultural environment. So those are my questions, and thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think about intention or the drivers behind this, I hesitate to sort of say, oh well, this is driven by racism. Like the sort of case that pops in my head is, oh wow, like I was going to cite this person until I found out they were Black, and then I decided not to. And I don't think that that's something that really goes on. I sort of take the point that the Kamsa White authors added or discussed, which was primarily about citational segregation. So a lot of this is, when you have a field where the people that have been able to build academic capital for the longest belong disproportionately to a single demographic group, that tends to be a right. So this is like one of the main findings of sociology, right? Like that tends to be, in the absence of interventions, a situation that reproduces itself more or less automatically, right? And so I think that is a big part of this. They talk about citational segregation, right? And I think the connection there to residential segregation, I think, is one that is quite intentional, and one that says, in the absence of interventions to disrupt that, it's a situation that's going to propagate and replicate, right? So if you think about the way that departments tend to propagate the disciplinary and theoretical perspectives that are their stock in trade, that comes with a set of citations, a set of considerations about who is really important, who is marginal. And unless we start paying attention to these kinds of issues, that's going to continue along as it has. And that's, I think, why the numbers that we see and the disparities that we see are likely to, in the absence of intervention, not change a whole lot. Now, as far as race versus gender goes, I think, I think that the number of individuals, so I think, it's almost certain to be white dominated. I'm not sure about the actual numbers. I'm actually not sure about the per individual disparities. My guess is probably that those would be more extreme than between men and women, particularly when you think about Black versus white. I'm really interested to see the Asian results, because I'm using US Census categories. And so, basically, which would lump together people from India, China, Korea, Japan, that sort of thing. I'm really interested in seeing those results. But my guess is that folks in the sort of the BIPOC area, Hispanics, Blacks, American natives, and those sorts of things, my guess is that the within individual means and medians are probably going to be a lot lower there. Yeah, that would be, and just, that's, yeah, chalk that up to citational segregation.
Can I just follow up?
Sure.
So I'm curious, because in the case of citational segregation, what is the theory, though? I mean, why do people of a certain race and ethnicity tend to cite more people of their same race and ethnicity? And the other thought that I had is that we do have anecdotal insight into the decision-making process based on our own experiences, right? When we're writing a paper and when we cite. And in my case, I realized that what I'm more concerned about, well, number one is like citing my advisor, I guess. And number two is who might read this paper and what are they going to think? And there you feel like you really need to cite at least 10 names that are the big names in your field, right? And they happen, when I think about it, I hadn't thought about it until now, but when I think about it, they happen to be white men for whatever reason. And time, like historical changes might be one of them, and I hope it's going to improve over time. So the people who have published in the field of, like, in the theory of segregational citation, what do they say is the mechanism that leads people to cite people from the same background?
Sure. So I think one of the issues that you run into there is that there's something of a remove between the data that you're using and the actual mechanisms that produce that data, right? So in other words, I'm looking at data that come out of JCR, right? So what I have is the end product. I can analyze that, 6 ways from Sunday, but at the end of the day, that doesn't really provide a whole lot of reasoning into or sort of insight into why. And the issue that you run into is that, if I was to, confront somebody about this, my guess is that a specific individual would likely get quite defensive about that, right? And they may not necessarily be super candid about why they do this, in part because, as you say, they hadn't really thought about it a whole lot, right? So, I don't really think, just as a matter of like practicalness, I don't think that's really like the best approach. But I think that you really just have to look at it in terms of the reproduction of the citational situation and the representational situation of when these fields, not just communication, but the social sciences in general, were a lot whiter and a lot more male. And so basically what we have is perceptions about the subdisciplines and the areas within our disciplines that are more important, that were disproportionately paid attention to by people who were in those categories. And so that ends up being a legacy of perceived rigor, of perceived importance that we still live with, right? And so in some ways, like I sort of pin the tail on path dependence here, because in many ways, the academy basically thrives on it and sort of builds off of it, right? Everything that we do is connected to a legacy, and that legacy is like super white and male. And so that results in that affects everything from our perceptions about what's important to who we need to cite ritually, right? When we do this kind of work to be able to get our work accepted. So I don't really have a whole lot of better explanation than that, in part because the data themselves don't allow me to speak to it more specifically.
Thank you.
I had a question, which is just about thinking about, preprints and how that matters for citations, if it does. And this might be something that's too new, but I mean, like you're seeing, at least I think very anecdotally, when you look at like papers that are working papers, but are in the sociological archives, they're already getting cited, right? So these are papers that are, I know, routinely also getting rejected from journals, but still they're building up their citation count already. And I mean, and this might be too new, right? Like I know SOC archives, for instance, is only like 5 years old or whatever, but I'm just curious about whether you have thoughts on how that might matter. Firstly, who's putting stuff in there and how that might matter for citation inequalities and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's a little early days for that. One thing I will say is that JCR's database is specifically designed for journals, and so when you look at the abbreviations that they use, it's actually pretty easy to figure out, especially when the citations are to specific journals. But I actually don't remember seeing too many preprints that were listed there. There were some reports, but my guess is that, like, from a computational standpoint, it would be a lot harder to pull those out because they weren't, pegged to sort of journals that were widely known in the field. And so that may be a methodological issue that goes there. The second issue I would think of is, are there disparities between gender, race, or other identity categories in the extent to which people make use of those kinds of archives? And allow the research community to be able to engage with that. I mean, another factor is that, like, there's no paywall there, so anybody can jump on and get those. So I think that would be another factor, the differences along identity lines of the uptake of that general practice of posting preprints.
So I've got I feel like this can only just be a depressing question, I guess. But given the the preeminence of path dependency that you were saying there, and things like the Matthew effect, which we haven't yet mentioned here, but it's clearly going to be relevant for these citation patterns. I mean, the fact that the whole effect that you had is driven by, 99th and the 100th percentile. Mm-hmm. Is any intervention, given the generations, or in this case, the century of dominance of white men in the field of communications, right? Do you actually have hope for interventions to make a substantial change within a time frame that we can actually, observe?
Yeah, I mean, well, so I think one answer to that will come when I look at the time series longitudinal data over the past 20 years, which I haven't had a chance to do yet. And so once I'm able to sort of look at, the number of citations to women, for example, over time, I think that'll help give me a better answer to that. But more generally, I would say that, it's important to have an understanding of what the problem is before you can solve it, right? So perceiving something as a problem and resolving to find ways to ameliorate it, I think, is essential to rectifying some of these inequalities. And I think that's what the Communications the White Paper did, and some of the papers that's sort of reciting that. That's what I'm trying to do. And even more broadly in society, if you look at what movements like Black Lives Matter and Me Too are trying to do, they're trying to really move identity to center stage. And my hope is that the scholarly community and the social sciences will be able to do something similar, even if the consequences aren't quite so dire as in those movements. We'll at least be able to take inspiration from those, understand identity as a really important determinative factor of outcomes in our respective disciplines, and act accordingly. That's what, and my hope is that I can, make some small contribution to that.
Yeah. Well, I think unless there are any outstanding questions, I think that's a very good and positive note to end on.